Teach me about the Great Lakes. Teach me about the Great Lakes. Welcome back to Teach Me About the Great Lakes, a twice monthly podcast in which I, a Great Lakes novice, ask people who are smarter and harder working than I am to teach me all about the Great Lakes. My name is Stuart Carlton. I work with Illinois Indiana Sea Grant, and I know all about the devastation of defeat when you lose a Little League baseball game because your own child couldn't get a hit. But I don't know a lot about the Great Lakes. That's the point of this podcast. I'm joined today by the one, the only, the special Carolyn Foley. How are you today, Carolyn?
Apparently I'm doing better than you because we did not lose in softball.
Oh.
But that's because, it's because we don't play. So.
Oh, well, that would be a reason. No, this was baseball, and it actually wasn't. It wasn't I shouldn't trash my kid in my own podcast. He did great. The fault is entirely with the assistant coach. I'm the head coach, for the record. Anyway, but today, let's jump straight in. We got a jam-packed show. I'm super excited about our interview. It's based on a book that I've read part of, but I can't wait to read the rest of. And so we are going to go straight into it.
Just a book that you legitimately messaged me and said, "Oh my goodness, I think I love this book."
Yeah, that's I think I love this book. I do, and so I'm super fired up. Anyway, to talk to the author of it, who is definitely not muted on the Zoom right now and may not ever chime in. So that is good. And news, Great Lakes news. Let's do it. We have Great Lake news today. Carolyn, you haven't done Great Lakes news before, have you?
I haven't. No. So I'll just sit back and watch.
Have you heard the Great Lakes news theme song?
I have not. So let's hear it now.
It's among our best. And now it's time for the Great Lakes News. Here's your host, Stuart Carlton. Thank you for that, Stuart. And the star of Great Lakes News, the one, the only, Sandra Svoboda of Great Lakes Now. How are you doing today?
I'm good. I'm still laughing about the entry theme song. I love it.
It is what it is. We all love it. We all love it. And it's top-notch work, worth every penny that we paid for it. So my understanding is you got 3 stories for us. Is that right? 3 stories?
It was a little bit, Stuart. I have 3 topics. The first one is
it's more of a topic than a story.
No, because I'm sneaking in more than one story with the first one because it's a project.
That's why you're a news professional. That's right.
Shameless self-promotion here. We've discussed this before. But yes, we have 3 GreatLakesNow.org is our news site. We have a monthly show on PBS stations, and we bring you news about the lakes you love. Sometimes it's not as good news, which is how we're going to start this week. But I promise, Stuart, the third one will have you smiling, I think. Maybe. At least it's an iconic symbol that, has a good story.
Meeting with you every few weeks has me smiling.
Oh, there we go. All right, anyway. So the first thing that we are going to talk about today is coal ash. So that is what's left over after we burn coal for energy, which goes on much less now than it used to. But all those decades of burning coal left us with, that's your cue, Stuart. You're supposed to guess.
It left us with coal ash. Oh, yes. I got it. Nailed it.
You are. I like to see if you're paying attention.
I was not. I was trying to find the website.
So coal ash is a political football, to put it bluntly, and make everyone read our stories. Oops, did I say that out loud? Okay, anyway, coal ash is really a serious topic of concern for a lot of environmentalists and communities and companies if they're looking to protect their sites from spilling this coal ash into drinking water, for example, the Great Lakes, other waterways. And that has happened where ponds have flooded and the heavy metals that are in the ash from when it is burned get into water and have wiped out some waterways. So I can't take credit for all of this because this project was actually done by journalism students at Northwestern University. Their professor, Carrie Leiderson, has been a writer for Great Lakes Now, been on our show. And so she brought us this package of stories and said, would you be interested in publishing them? The Energy News Network is going to publish 12 stories from an international project, but they also have a lot of focus on the Great Lakes. I, of course, said yes. Anything I can do without working is always good. But also, we didn't only publish the stories, we built our monthly show out of it because we think it's really that important of an issue. When we're talking really serious water quality issues, it's impossible to say exactly what the risk is, like many environmental topics, and what risk we are all willing to live with, and what is the risk and reward or cost, either financially to prevent these things from happening or cleaning up are all part of this discussion. And so there's a series of stories that range from Waukegan, Illinois, Joliet, the Finger Lakes, where there's a Bitcoin mine that's of concern, some other national stories that you can go to greatlakesnow.org/Cole Ash and see this entire project. Really a lot of good in-depth reporting. And I got to give the students props here.
A Bitcoin mine? Wait, what? Now I'm confused.
Nope,
What-
don't ask the question. Don't do it. It's not worth it.
We don't want the feedback?
No, just I feel like that would be a whole episode in and of itself. Like, yeah.
All right. I'm sorry, we're not having a whole episode on Bitcoin mining. All right.
Oh, but Cole Ash, Stuart, I tried to get you to do a whole episode on Cole Ash. So instead, I'm just going to keep talking about our project.
Well, there's story one. Go to see the Cole Ash thing. It has been demanded. The show has been taken hostage. It has been hostily. It's a hostile takeover.
It's
Now we
not
must at
hostile
some
at
point
all.
do Cole Ash. We'll do that. But for now, story two.
Story two. So story two is also kind of a series of stories that is ongoing, and it's also really a national issue. So I know this is Teach Me About the Great Lakes, but the Great Lakes are also have similar issues to places all over the country, especially when it comes to harmful algal blooms. So this, of course, makes headlines for Lake Erie. We get a forecast every year because back in 2014, that pesky blue-green algae shut down the drinking water system for the city of Toledo, Ohio. Well, nothing gets scientists and policymakers and lawmakers' attention like a crisis, right? So a lot of work has been done since then on monitoring the bloom. You've had Eddie on to talk about the buoys and water quality control that are there. And there has also been for a few years a documentary in the making. It's called The Erie Situation, and that's starting to make the film festival circuit and will making its broadcast debut on PBS, some of the PBS stations around Lake Erie. So in the kind of the seasonal thing, it's not just the documentary, but the news that's out there about the algal bloom, this has been an issue in Lake Erie. We have a Q&A from a researcher talking about kind of what those priorities should be. And then also some other stories that are, so again, this is kind of a series of stories and an ongoing issue, but I didn't realize until I was doing the research for this, just how many states have problems with algal blooms just in the last month, even beyond the Great Lakes, beyond their Great Lakes coast, Pennsylvania and New York, and then a lot of West Coast, California, Montana, Oregon, Utah, Idaho, all have issues with the harmful algal blooms. I sort of skipped over what they are, Stuart, because I, being a member of your audience, know how smart your audience is for this podcast.
Yes.
But
Smarter than I am, except in one specific choice they make, but that's okay.
But it is a serious issue for drinking water and also pets. I think a lot of people don't realize how dangerous these blooms can be for pets, kids that get in the water. If your dog is drinking the water, then that can be a real problem. And there have been deaths in Lake Erie. So the bloom forecast in Lake Erie was for being a little bit better than normal. As we're recording this, we're having cool weather, and I'm knocking on wood that we don't jump back to 100 degrees again. But harmful algal blooms an issue we keep an eye on, and I guess I'll give the shout out. We're always looking for the new research, what's going to be happening that scientists are working on in conjunction with the communities that need to know. They draw their water from the lakes and systems where these blooms occur. What's going on in that regard to keep us all safe?
So that's fantastic. And we will be having a live show talking about issues on Lake Erie.
Okay, this gives me a chance to be promotional. If you're interested in Lake Erie, I know squat about Lake Erie, I'll be honest. In fact, I drove to Buffalo this summer, and I was super excited because I thought I would get to see Lake Erie as I drove through Cleveland. But the car was kind of short, and the highway barriers were high, and so I saw no Lake Erie. I was so upset. I was on the phone with my dad, not that I was talking while I was driving, of course, but I was like actively sad. So I've never even seen Lake Erie. I've been to Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, but not seen Lake Erie.
Stuart, it is my job as the Great Lakes Now program director to be the ambassador of tourism for the Great Lakes as well. And I'm just going to point out, you could have pulled off the interstate.
That would have been an option.
That would have been an option. Just making sure that's available.
Once I go white line fever. But anyway, so I'm excited to learn about Lake Erie. And the way I'm going to do it is this, because I'm going to do it the laziest way possible, which is to have fun doing it. And the way that we're going to do it is with our live show, September 13th, live from Masthead Brewing Company in Cleveland, Ohio, as part of Sea Grant Week. So if you're going to be at Sea Grant Week, or if you just live in Cleveland, like I assume many of you do, most of the listeners may live in Cleveland for all I know, come to Masthead Brewery about 8 o'clock, we think. And we're going to have Chris Winslow, the director of Ohio Sea Grant, the first Sea Grant bigwig we've ever had. And we're going to play a fun game with Chris. He knows a lot about a lot of different issues in Lake Erie. And so we're going to probe his knowledge live, Masthead Brewery, or just wait and it'll download it, and that's later. Sadly, no Great Lakes news on that one, Sandra. I apologize.
Well, that's okay. I'll still listen to it.
But for right now, what is story 3?
Okay, so story 3 is about the Isle Royale Wolves. So Stuart, you are new to the Great Lakes region. Do you know where Isle Royale is?
I do know where Isle Royale is, actually, thanks to our guest on episode number, 3. We invited Loreen Neuenhuis, who is an author and adventurer. She wrote a book about wandering the Great Lakes, walking around all of the Great Lakes, and she talked to us a bit about Isle Royale and about how she was out there, and she carried wolf or moose heads, moose skulls as part of like this community science thing. So if you look on the Great Lakes, I'm not even kidding. If you look on our very cool artwork by Joel Davenport, you will see a moose skull, and that was inspired by the moose community science that Loreen Neuenhuis does, and other people on Isle Royale. So that is the extent of my knowledge of Isle Royale.
Okay, but you know there are wolves on Isle Royale. Do you know that?
I'm just
wolves
learning
and
there are
moose.
wolves on Isle Royale.
So this goes back, I mean, I don't even want to say how many decades, but I remember going to Isle Royale with my family when I was in junior high. I mean, some kids got to go to Disney World. I got to go to Isle Royale with a backpack. And I remember what an impression that made, that there were moose and wolves on that island, that we were hiking around. So, and, it's sort of a very unique place in the Great Lakes. It's one of the most remote and least visited national parks. And so the wolves and the moose are often making headlines for many years because their populations were in a bit of trouble, like down to 2 wolves on the island. And so there has been a story that we have on our website at greatlakesnow.org, and it was written by John Flesher, who's the Associated Press environmental writer. We talked about him in a previous episode. Boy, John, getting the word out about the Great Lakes and that international news network. We appreciate that. So anyway, it looks like the gray wolf population has made a really dramatic comeback this year, and they think it's as many as, Stuart, guess how many wolves they believe are on Isle Royale now?
All right, I'm going to do it, but we're going to do it the way that we do it, which always works. So I'm going to take a guess, and you're going to tell me if I'm right or if I'm wrong. So here we go. 14,697.
Oh, that's it. How did you know? Okay, I'm joking. These podcasts are hard. People can't see me laughing. But no, 28, which 28. Is,
that's
really
huge, though.
It is. And really, I look at this, and the story that we have, again, from John, that talks about the numbers of the moose population, too, because, Stuart, big question here. What do you think the relationship is between the wolves and the moose on Isle Royale?
Funny you should ask. They eat them.
Which way?
Well, who knows? No, the wolves eat the moose. The wolves eat the moose.
Very
moose
good.
Can't eat. They aren't that fast. Yeah.
The wolves do eat the moose. And so, so they live in tandem with complicated ecosystem, another theme of the show. So, the moose population up and down as well. But right now there are several hundreds of moose on the island, and that's sustaining the wolf population of about 28 right now. So
This is interesting. This actually does touch into something, and that is great news. This touches into a couple things that I do happen to know a little bit about, not about Isle Royale specifically, but wolf introductions is one of the foundational creation myths of my field, essentially, of the human dimensions of conservation, because wolves were, I think, completely extirpated, which means locally extinct in the northern Rocky areas in the 20th century, if not completely, then virtually completely. And in the 90s, which is when my field was fairly young, but starting to really develop, a lot of social scientists did work to analyze the costs and benefits of wolf reintroduction. And they found that, the costs of the reintroduction, like the economic costs, were going to be low, like on the order of 1% of the benefits of reintroducing the wolves, because people will come to see them and things like that. And so that was that was some of the really important work. And then in the early part of the 20th century, they reintroduced them. The U.S. federal government reintroduced them, and it's been a big success. There are like 100 mooses or more. Mooses. Come on, Stuart. Wolves? I don't know why I'm talking about mooses. I do. It's your fault. But anyway, wolves. I got moose on the brain. That big moose skull. There are like 100 of them. There are, I think, 1,000 in Idaho, and so it was a real big success story. But then, of course, there's the flip side.
Right. You can see me going, wait a minute, Stuart. Success by whose measure?
That's the problem with wolves is, I mean, it's a predator and people get legitimately nervous about them. And I understand that, right?
Ranchers, the whole ranching community out there. And I mean, there's been a lot of that. I mean, we're a little out of the Great Lakes region. We don't have the same issues here, but we do have the wolf hunt, that's controversial in several of the Great Lakes states, and whether that will happen or not. But it will not on Isle Royale because it's a national park. So.
Yeah, so there it's purely a success. That's what I was kind of thinking about. It's interesting because in UP itself, I found a 2007 study on the, I'll link to it, on wolf acceptance capacity. There's this concept called wildlife acceptance capacity, which is like the most number of wolves that people will accept in an area. And then there's also like the minimum tolerance, right? And you have people who have different minimum tolerances. That's the minimum they want to have in an area. And the acceptance capacity is the most will stand. And the challenge with wolves is that people have very different views on those. For some people, the minimum tolerance is quite a few because they want to know that moose are there, or wolves. They want to know the wolves are there. They all know that moose are there. Anyway, and other people don't want any because of their fear. And so it is complicated, but it's great to see this on an area where the complication is removed because of the national park. And it's great to see that happening. I would like to point out
that this is probably the best example of all of the times I've co-hosted with Stuart. This is probably the best example that I'm like, yep, Stuart's not from the Great Lakes, because anyone from the Great Lakes Basin, you hear Isle Royale and you're like, wolves. And you're just talking about moose right now.
Sandra, where can people go to find out more news about the lakes that they love?
You can find news about the lakes you love, Stuart, any day at greatlakesnow.org. Thanks so much for having me.
You are welcome, and we will take you out with the Great Lakes Now theme song composed by
Clint Carpenter.
We will take you out now with the Great Lakes theme song composed by the amazing Clint Carpenter. Researcher feature, a feature in which a researcher gonna teach us about the Great Lakes. Our guest today is Dr. Lynn Heasley. She is a professor at the Institute of Environment and Sustainability at Western Michigan University. And her most recent book is delightful, The Accidental Reef and Other Ecological Odysseys in the Great Lakes. And it is the 2022 Nautilus Silver winner for lyric prose. Lynn, how are you today?
I am fantastic today. It's a beautiful day. I got to teach my first class, and it was just so wonderful being back in person in the classroom with my students where we were all in 3 dimensions.
That is good. Is this your first in person in a couple of years, or has it been?
It's the first in a couple of years because I was on research sabbatical last year.
Oh, that'll do it. What were you on research? Was that about the accidental reef or something new?
So I had finished up the accidental reef and have been doing some book gigs related to that, but I've started new research extending from the accidental reef, but some new ideas, some new places that I'm exploring.
So let's go to the book that has already been written, because I really want to ask questions about the new one. But so it's called The Accidental Reef, as we've mentioned, and is about a reef in the St. Clair River. So what is this reef and why is it accidental?
Yes. So the accidental reef is kind of the touchstone and maybe the heart and soul of the book. It's a tiny little spawning ground in the North Channel of the St. Clair River Delta. And it's accidental because it's a little accident of industrial history. And perhaps we'll get more into this, but this area was an industrial epicenter of American industry from about the mid 1800s to the mid 1900s. And during that time, a particular steamship that was serving salt mines, a particular salt mine near Algonac, dumped its coal waste over and over and over in the same place. And this was in the exact decades when lake sturgeon were about to be persecuted to near extinction in the Great Lakes as well. And so this little pile of coal clinkers, and I know that the audience won't see it, but I brought one here for you two to see. They look like little chunks of small lava. This little pile of coal clinkers became this unknown refuge for lake sturgeon during the years when they almost went extinct. And it wasn't located until the mid 1990s. And so it's both the irony, but also the wonder that the product of the industrial history that actually compromised this area so profoundly also provided, these safe harbor in places for, fish like lake sturgeon, walleye, bass, and also kind of the, spawning ground for some of the invaders eventually, like round gobies and zebra mussels.
So it's just a spot for everybody to hang out. So
spot, and it's a gathering place. and I treat it as a gathering place in the book. So so even though as you know, those ecological odysseys spiral across space, across time, sometimes across eons, they gather at this little accidental reef, and so the fish and other aquatic life encounter each other, but eventually I bring in scuba divers, fish biologists, and other fishers and sports people who also connect with each other at the reef and transform each other and then spiral off into their own historical or ecological journeys.
So I think we can sort of understand based on what you've already said, but you use the St. Clair River and this accidental reef as sort of a starting off point for a broader discussion about the Great Lakes, right? Maybe it spawns a discussion about the Great Lakes, as it were. And so with that, why is it that the St. Clair River is such a great entry point in your mind? Why did you choose that as the starting off place?
Well, it's, I probably have three parts to that question in terms of my own answer, but first of all, I had wanted to write a book about the Great Lakes for a very long time because of my teaching. I teach American environmental history, Great Lakes history, introduction to environmental studies, water and environmental justice. And I've accumulated all of these stories and histories of the Great Lakes that even my Michigander students who grew up in this area didn't know about. And sometimes they're very random. Like they might not have known that the equivalent board feet of a maple tree Henry Ford would use in one of his Model Ts.
Yeah, they might not have known that. Yeah.
And that Henry Ford himself had purchased 430,000 acres up in the UP of timberland in order to serve, his factories down on the Detroit River. So I wanted to put this together in a way into a bigger and complicated picture of the Great Lakes that still honored these stories. But the problem with that is it became more like an encyclopedia in my mind. I could never give it a structure or a shape, and any of us could edit an encyclopedia of these stories, but that's not what I wanted to do. And the reason it was so hard for me is I'm very place-based myself, both in terms of my background, in terms of my approach to living in the Great Lakes, in terms to what I teach my students. And I needed a place. And so the St. Clair River had been very intriguing to me because there's literally no Great Lakes environmental issue that the St. Clair River either isn't a poster child for exemplifying. So take toxic pollution from a century of industry, literally bombarding the region, the river, but also the longer Huron-Erie corridor, or issues that actually got their foothold in the Great Lakes. And so the first establishment of zebra mussels was in the St. Clair River on the Canadian side, followed by round gobies, followed by quagga mussels. And so that whole series of Ponto-Caspian invaders got themselves established and first identified in the St. Clair River. So that's two things. One, that issue of a place. Two, the centrality of the St. Clair River itself for all of the Great Lakes issues and problem solving we care about. And then the third is I've got a soft spot always for places that people don't, and people that aren't fully appreciated. And so the St. Clair River's big sister, so to speak, would be the Detroit River. And that's where a lot of the study, the books, the action, the biodiversity promotion, it's always the Detroit River. And yet there's so much happening in the St. Clair River. And so it was my chance to honor the lesser known of the corridor, which would be the St. Clair River.
That's fantastic. So it's such an important spot for the ecology. But then I remember a couple of years ago on Valentine's Day, our colleagues at the NOAA Great Lakes Environmental Research Laboratory had put out a series of Valentines, and one of them was focused on the St. Clair River Delta. And there were a number of people who commented on social media like, "Oh, so glad to see this getting some love." So I think you're not alone there. So you mentioned that you have some readings in the books, and you talked a little bit about the gathering space for different like that the St. Clair River and this reef in particular is completely affected by anything that happens in the Great Lakes. I wonder if you can share your story about showing zebra mussels as villains.
Oh, okay. So zebra mussels as villains. Yes, I'll do a reading in which I put both my my historian's hat, which won't be totally apparent, but the framing of it, any environmental historian would recognize the turn that I make, but also the storytelling involving science and how we as Great Lakes citizens react to the incursion of a species like zebra mussels. And often we vilify these newcomers who completely turn the existing food webs upside down and maybe threaten the place that we've come to love for so long. And yet, as soon as you vilify or tell that story, whether it's through science or whether it's through our visceral reactions, it oversimplifies and keeps us from understanding how these zebra mussels might connect, how eventually the ecosystem might adapt to them, but also keeps us from knowing them as well for their own sake. So I'll do a little passage here. Let's see if I can find it. So this is from chapter 2 of the book. L.P. Hartley once wrote that the past is a foreign country. Aquatic residents of today's St. Clair River would not recognize the same river of 1987. That was the year before zebra mussels. On first contact in the Americas, in Lake St. Clair, zebra mussels, Dreissena polymorpha of the family Dreissenidae, launched something akin to species-on-species combat. Hundreds or thousands to one, they would descend on some unfortunate native. Indigenous clams like Leptodea fragilis, Pecanodon grandis, Lampsilus silicoidea, Patanolus alatus, Elliptio dilatata, and 15 others of the family Unionidae or Unionids. A military field manual for a mussel attack might read like this: attach yourself to the rear of the first Unionid you find. Do this by planting your foot on its shell. Note that your foot is actually a mussel. Press down. This stimulates the byssal gland in your foot to make upwards of 600 threads. Use the cement-strong grip of your sticky byssal threads to hold fast. Should you wish to detach, release an enzyme to dissolve the byssal thread proteins. Your opponent is large while you are little. With your comrades, pile on. 15,000 Dreissenids once sacked a single Unionid. So weigh down your clam, disrupt its movement, gash its home ground. Then, as the Unionid inhales, creating a microcurrent in the water to suck in microfood into its waiting vent, intercept the food, filter it out of the water column. The native shell, thus fouled, it will starve from your intimate interference. Warfare is one way to see what happened below the surface of Lake St. Clair. Shell crashed on shell, and 18 Unionid species dwindled, then died out. The whole process, invade, colonize, dominate, extirpate, took 8 years. This is how a Unionid would remember 1988 and beyond, if a clam had memories. Local clams were there first. They didn't deserve their fate. The place is poor for their loss, an ecological yin of interdependence, adaptation, and balance, countered by a brutal new yang of conflict, dislocation, and instability. One web of life torn apart. And yet, pause for a moment on words like native, invade, colonize, foul, extirpate, all in the scientific literature on zebra mussels. Are these objective verbs and nouns, facts on the ground, exact accounts of ecosystem dynamics? Perhaps they're subjective, dramas with victims and villains, moral metaphors, tragedies. Biology's Latinesque language lends itself to science and storytelling, omniscience and emotion, Minerva and Mars. So how would Dreissena polymorpha retell the story if mollusks had memories?
That's fantastic. So this is something at the recent Joint Aquatic Sciences meeting, a colleague was holding on to another in like non-native species to the Great Lakes region, a sea lamprey. And she said, she told me, she said, it's this majestic creature. And I thought, you're just doing what you do. And she said, I need to think that when I'm working with the mussels, that they are just doing what they do. So thanks so much for sharing that with us.
It shows the language. When you listen to that language, the combat language, it really is like a very specific framing, right? And I think that the way you did that was just, I don't want to sit there and slobber all over everything. That was a brilliant piece of science communication, because there's so much that you can learn in there, but it's done in such a narrative way. And so I have two questions to follow from that. What do you think about with non-native species, and specifically thinking about the way that we talk about them and the specific language we use? How do you think that affects the way that people think about them?
I think for one thing, we do create these villains and these heroes. A lot of it has to do with how we want to use the water and the place itself. But I think one of the issues with that kind of combat language, and by the way, it's changing, so even the scientists themselves are considering and changing their storytelling and their language. I think what it does is take the sense of time out. And so even though this chapter is going to follow the evolutionary history of the zebra mussels, I don't really bring that up to date until later on in the book. And so we're not set in one place and one time. And so eventually, for better or worse, when it comes to these non-native species, the aquatic ecosystems do adapt, they do adjust, they do change. And some of that is in ways that we either grieve because we're unhappy for the species that we do care a lot about, and some of it really is a kind of adaptation where we can see signs of hope later. And so later in the book, there's a very well-known Unionid scientist at Central Michigan University, Dave Zanata, and he's actually seen a few refugia of some of these native clams, and here's one of them. I got this from the Black River. But he and his group, they sample and they're seeing some of them. And so what I think that the hero villain framing does is keep us from keeping track of complexity and then watching more closely over time how the system itself is changing. And maybe that would drive some of our policymaking and some of our interventions as well.
Great. And then, bringing this back to the accidental reef itself, thinking that, what presumably was a dump that was not something that we would want could actually then be refuge for this extraordinarily important, wonderful, I love lake sturgeon. So there's, I got to hold the little ones and help them release them one time. And they're just incredible creatures. So, there is an ability to adapt. That's really, really cool.
And the location and discovery of this accidental reef actually laid the groundwork for the more major discovery of a much larger and sturgeon spawning site under the Blue Water Bridge itself, which crosses from the U.S. to Canada. And that's a key part of the story in the second part of the book too, is how that little accident of industrial history itself created the knowledge base for a couple of divers that I focus on, who then go on to discover, again, I'll say probably the most important sturgeon spawning site in the Great Lakes system itself.
And that very site would lead the sturgeon one day to become a runner-up for the 2021 Lakey for Animal of the Year. So that's really nice.
I did not know that. Thank you.
Yeah.
Why runner up? I find that problematic.
Because Carolyn wasn't on that particular episode. That's why.
No, we have an awards show at the end of each year, and so sturgeon runner-up is very good. But the piping plovers won.
Oh gosh, yeah, Monty and Rose breaking my heart this year. Okay, yeah.
Exactly. Okay, so my second question is this, sort of building off the idea of language, and I'm going to let the readers. Actually, I'm going to call you listeners because you're listening right now and not reading. I'm going to let the listeners in a little bit behind the curtain, and that is when we invite people on, we don't have time to do a full review of their work, but so I gave myself 2 hours to prepare for the interview with Lynn, and I knew she had this book. And she was like, "Are you going to read my book beforehand?" And I said, "Oh, yeah, I'll skim it." So I was like, all right, I need to skim this out of respect, of course. But I can read a scientific paper if we're going to have a scientist on in 2 hours. I can't read a whole book. And so I was like, let me just skim, get the high points of it. And I found myself, I couldn't stop reading the book. I drafted 0 questions during this whole 2 hour period because I kept getting sucked into, because we've read other Great Lakes books before and they're valuable, but the writing in this is so vital. It's beautiful, of course, which is why it won this Silver Award for lyric prose. I assume that the Silver Award is the highest award, and if there's a Gold Award, then you should have won the Gold Award. It's hilarious in certain points, right? But what I really get is this feeling that you were there, like your personality. I don't know you, but I feel like your personality is just drenching this book. And so I guess my question is this. We, as science communicators, a lot, we work with scientists, and you are not like a natural or biophysical scientist, but, we think a lot about the difference between, or the trade-offs in allowing our personality out, right? Have you thought about that? Like, how does that work with your work? Or do people ever push back on what you do and say, it's too subjective, or it's too in your voice to be good, good information? What are your thoughts on that, I guess?
I'll answer that in 2 ways. One, even though I think any academic environmental historian or cultural geographer reading this would absolutely see the underlying research and the perspective that is historical and geographic. There's
a lot of footnotes.
50 pages of footnotes, so you don't have to read all of that. But yes, footnotes are kind of a compulsion for many of us. But at the same time, none of them would recognize it, in my opinion, as academic environmental history. And so I gave myself the freedom then to allow the passion, sometimes the subjectivity, sometimes the deep dives and random digressions. Probably some people might not want to finish the little digression I took into filamentous bacteria in a paper mill. But I wanted to imbue it with that life and that spirit and that sense of place and that sense of passion. And so that meant, leaving some of my academic street cred behind and shoving the academic street cred into the footnotes, and that's another meeting ground, right? So you'll see all the scientific literature, the historical literature, the literature. So, so for people who want that, they can go right to the footnotes. But I wanted to visualize and feel and experience, because that's a major goal of the book, which is to help people see and know the Great Lakes differently than they do now. And it might not be all of the Great Lakes, but it might be a part of the Great Lakes. Back to your point on working with the scientists, what's really interesting about what you said is if you go out in the field with scientists, and my PhD is in forest and wildlife ecology, so I have a lot of, science, humanities interface in my background. They're as passionate as anyone. They are as excited as anyone. One of the profound moments that I had, very small, that stuck with me is I went out to look at a river with a former colleague who's retired now. And so he and his grad student were out sampling the river, and he worked with caddisfly shells, on the bottom of a rock. So they did some sampling, and he was going to return some of the fish that he had in the lab back into the river. And one of them got squashed by a rock. And he was very distressed that fish got squashed by a rock. It really touched him. He wanted to safely release it. So I think that sense of passion and connection is a change in the last 20 years or so. We are allowing ourselves that, because if we don't express our passion and connection, then how in the world can we inspire the public or other people to feel connected and passionate enough to work on these issues? And so, I little plug for the scientists and their deep commitment and passion.
That's fantastic. And so, as someone who has thought way too much about how Bissell threads form, that I got that all the science and the images, I was like, yeah, that's exactly it. It's just told in such a vivid way. It's really great. So one other idea that you explore in the book is the idea of water abundance in the Great Lakes in comparison with other areas. And you say that the Great Lakes has escaped the paradox of abundance. So what is the paradox of abundance, and how did the Great Lakes escape it?
Okay. All right. I think so that listeners aren't completely confused, maybe I'll set up the book structure a little bit, and then where that paradox of abundance fits into the overall book structure. And so the book is divided into 3 parts. Part 1 is hyperlocal, underwater, very ecological. And so at that scale, I'm introducing the Great Lakes in this tiny little spot in the St. Clair River. Part 2, just called On Seeing and Knowing, an Underwater Biography. It's more that human scale that many of us are comfortable with, the scale of a river, the scale of communities engaging that river, learning that river, trying to problem solve on behalf of that river. So where many of us exist professionally or personally. And then part 3 of the book, the starting scale, are those epic scales that are almost beyond our imagination. The Great Lakes themselves, as having, depending on whether you're consulting the USGS or the EPA, either 84% of the fresh surface water in North America, or maybe I think the USGS says 95%, but I think that's probably for the US alone. That's a scale that's hard to get your mind around. But also, the history of the Great Lakes is one of extraction of its resources beyond anything that we can get our minds around. I mean, just the sheer immensity of resource after resource after resource. The last 2 flocks of the passenger pigeons, one was in Michigan, one was in Wisconsin. And there had been a time where people thought passenger pigeons could never run out, right? The same with Great Lakes, eastern white pine up in the UP, and then northern Minnesota and northern Wisconsin. So the immensity in scale, and then that's what connects us globally, because we're part of that really extractive, predator-based capitalist economy in which much of the Great Lakes has been, sucked out in order to serve industry or to end up somewhere else in the world too. So in terms of the paradox of abundance, the paradox itself is my argument that, and it marks probably much of environmental history, the very immensity or vastness of wealth in a particular resource or a particular part of the more than human world, its very immensity immediately lays the seeds for its destruction, its extraction, and that extraction can happen too fast for the lags of human regret and policy to catch up with. So that is the story of the Great Lakes. It's the story of North American environmental history, just extraction on a large scale. Iron in the Mesabi Range of Minnesota, eastern white pine here, salt. We have some of the largest deposits of salt, and it just goes on and on and on. Well, my argument about water is that somehow the Great Lakes, as an immense body of water, have not followed that fate, that paradox of abundance. We have not become the Aral Sea. And we also don't have pipelines, sending our water out to the Central Valley of California to irrigate their agriculture. So why is that? How is it that so far, and it's fragile and vulnerable, and there are horrifying kind of news accounts now that should raise great insecurity on this count for all of us in terms of Great Lakes water conservation. But how is it that no matter how polluted, no matter how abused in different ways, we still have over 20% of the world's surface freshwater relatively intact and not being diverted on a mass scale in a way that compromises its use for us and its use for the other creatures and beings who live among us too. And so the partial answer that I and my colleague Dan McFarland.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask. All right, so now you set up the paradox, right? And so
the partial answer, and maybe the whole answer, is that it is an international body of water. So it is jointly used and managed by the U.S. and Canada. And then I think we have to be fair, add in all of the tribes and First Nations. And so I will, we tend to call it binational. I would say we should call it multinational or trinational in certain places, especially the St. Clair River. But the very fact that that it occupies two countries and several other First Nations and tribal communities, that very fact meant that going all the way back to the 19th and early 20th century, the US and Canada had to negotiate its future. They had to be proactive and anticipatory instead of reactive. And the paradox of abundance is one continual reaction after another. Clear cut the Great Lakes forest. All right, we'll have new forms of forestry, but the Great Lakes forest has been clear cut. But with the Great Lakes, you had two countries who had to negotiate their use and negotiate their future together. And no matter how problematic that history actually has turned out to be, you did end up with the Boundary Waters Treaty of 1909 and the establishment of the International Joint Commission, and then eventually this legal scaffolding that requires at least some forward-looking, future-looking anticipation of problems and trying to forego those problems ahead of time. So we do have this paradox of abundance that drives our use of immense natural resources. But so far, the international dimension of the Great Lakes has been protective of the Great Lakes in this one area.
And just that so many people value it, and like all the tribes and everyone too. It's strong identity. So
fascinating thought that we were forced to be cooperative and forced to be proactive, and that makes a big difference. Well, this is really interesting, Lynn, and we're so glad that you've come on to tell us about this. And I can't say enough how much I love this book. I love it enough that I'm actually going to read the whole thing, which even though I was a literature major, that is a high bar to clear in my life right now. But learning about the Great Lakes and the St. Clair River and the paradox of abundance is not actually why we invited you here on Teach Me About the Great Lakes this week. The reason that we invited you on Teach Me About the Great Lakes is to ask two questions. And the first one is this. If you could choose to have a great donut for breakfast or a great sandwich for lunch, which one would you choose?
Hands down a sandwich, for sure. The complexity of it, right? I live for complexity. So a donut is sugar, salt, and fat. Right?
I love it. That's right. You're not going to get a bouquet from a donut, right? You're not going to get, there's no umami. Yeah. That's good. So I think you're at what? You're at Western Michigan, which is in Kalamazoo.
Yep, Kalamazoo.
So I'm going to go to Kalamazoo and I'm going to stop by Bell's. I'm going to get myself a hop slam, 2-hearted ale. Then I'm going to sleep it off. And the next day, I'm going to be hungry for lunch. And I'm going to want to go get a sandwich. Where should I go in Kalamazoo to get a really great sandwich?
Oh, that's a tough one. Would you call a taco a sandwich too? Does a taco?
Absolutely. Well, we're not getting into that, but tacos count.
They count as a sandwich?
The reason we don't ask about tacos is then the answer would be obvious to this question, right?
We've got this little local place downtown. It's fairly new. It survived COVID, thankfully. And I always forget if it's Ma Familia or La Familia, but you can get their amazing taco. I think it's called Barilla. It's their special taco. It's really fantastic, and then get the dipping sauce that goes with it too. Really incredible.
We will put a link to that in our show notes at teachmeaboutthegreatlakes.com/65 because this is episode 65.
Okay.
So what is a special place in the Great Lakes that you'd like to share with our audience, and what makes it special?
Oh, I think that is the feared question of all Great Lakes writers. I think we're so afraid of that question. And the reason we're afraid of it is because anyone who writes about the Great Lakes, and I'm part of a very large community of Great Lakes writers, actually, who do wonderful work. We're all intensely curious and love every place that we go. And so I think for me, if I'm going to answer that question for 2022, based on this summer, I think I would recommend a journey rather than a specific place. And the journey would be to cross either the bridge at Detroit Windsor or the Blue Water Bridge at Port Huron Sarnia, go up the Bruce Peninsula, stop in Tobermory, catch the ferry, and spend some time on Manitoulin Island. And Manitoulin Island is the largest freshwater island in the world, but it's a place that's not too far from us and that many, many people won't see in their lifetimes. It's a gorgeous island. It's got many First Nations on it. It's in Lake Huron itself, and Lake Huron is one of those lesser appreciated Great Lakes that people should get to know more. And so I would say journey up the peninsula and go to Manitoulin Island. And then maybe circle back around on the North Shore and come back down via Sault Ste. Marie. I'd say do a circle.
And this is not our first, believe it or not, this is not our first Manitoulin Island recommendation.
Fabulous.
Go listen to Teach Me About the Great Lakes number 54, titled Water is Sacred. And hear Dr. Laura Lee McGregor from the Ontario School of Medicine and a member of the Whitefish River First Nation. Anyway, she also recommends Manitoulin Island. Well, Dr. Lynn Heasley, professor at the Institute of Environment and Sustainability at Western Michigan University and author of what I promise will be a Lakey nominee this year, The Accidental Reef and Other Ecological Odysseys in the Great Lakes. Thank you so much for coming on and teaching us all about the Great Lakes.
It was a pleasure. Thank you both so much.
Anyway, what a fantastic guest. I absolutely love that book. I can't wait to finish reading it. Like I said, it just really sucked me in, and it's just a different way to get into these Great Lakes issues. So
it sounds like it's a great one.
Hey, and we did plug it earlier, but I want to remind everybody, live show September 13th, around 8 o'clock at the Masthead Brewery. Masthead? Yep. Carolyn and I can't ever remember. Between the two of us, we have trouble remembering if it's Masthead or Mastodon.
Yes, that's 100% accurate.
But we'll be out at the Masthead Brewing Company is actually what it's called. And so come join us. It should be a lot of fun if you're there. And if you hit me up, I'll probably have stickers if you're there early enough. So let's do that.
Teach Me About the Great Lakes is brought to you by the fine people at Illinois Indiana Sea Grant. We encourage you to check out the great work we do at iiseagrant.org and at ILIN Grant on Facebook, Twitter, and other social media. Teach Me About the Great Lakes is produced by Hope Charters, Carolyn Foley, Megan Gunn, and Renee Miles. Ethan Chitty is our associate producer and fixer. Our super fun podcast artwork is by Joel Davenport. The show is edited by the awesome Quinn Rose, and we encourage you to check her work out at aspiringrobot.com. If you have a question or comment about the show, please email it to teachmeaboutthegreatlakes@gmail.com or leave a message on our hotline that gets tons and tons of phone calls all the time. 765.
Call us, people. We're lonely.
765-496-IISG. You can also follow the show on Twitter at Teach Great Lakes. Thanks for listening and keep grading those lakes.
Beep,